So the next step is to explain a little bit about the different types of spacing we can add to our HTML elements. One of them is margin, which is spacing outside the element, and the other one is padding, which is spacing inside the element. And I'm going to explain about the difference between the two. And I'm going to use the units that we used before, sorry, not EM, but we're going to use pixels and REM, which is the relative size to the root element font size. So again, feel free to go over the other unit sizes and play with them if you want to use something else. Maybe you will find a good use cases for using something else. So what I want to do in my website is I want to add another div element. Let me just copy paste those two. And let's call this container 2 maybe. I don't know if it's a good class name, but I'm just going to use it now because I can think of anything better than that. And I will copy those values so they will have the same width and height. I'm going to change the color. So we will have a way to distinguish between the two. Okay, let's use this one. And I have two elements, one next to the other. Now I want to put them on the same line. We saw before there are multiple ways of putting div elements on the same line because div elements are display blocks, so they're blocking the entire row. I want to put them on the same row. So one thing I can do is I can wrap them in another div. And let's call it folder. Again, I don't know if it's a good name. You can think of better names than me. I'm just going to give it a name. And I'm going to say it's display flex. I'm going to go over here, class, folder. Now the naming doesn't really matter. I can change everything here or this name to X. I can just have it as X and it will work, just naming. So maybe I'm not choosing the best names here, but you can kind of ignore the naming. You can choose your own naming if there is a better name that makes sense for you. And voila, you can see I have this display flex. I have those two divs, one next to the other, and we have them on the same row. Now, what I want to do is I want to have some space between them. Now, there are many ways of applying space to display flex to a flex box, but I don't want to distribute the empty area. So if you remember in display flex box or display flex, we can take this extra space and distribute it between the elements depending on the type of justify content that we are using. Instead, I want to have some fixed width or fixed spacing between the two. And what I want is I want to take the first div and I want to add some spacing to the right of it. So I want to add some spacing to the right of the div that you see is highlighted, and it will push the other div to the right. And the way I can do that, I can go over here and do margin right. And let's say, I don't know, 20 pixels. Again, I'm using pixels, which is an absolute unit value for spacing. And what you can see, I'm getting this orange area, which we saw before. And right now, this orange area is the size of 20 pixels. Another way of checking it, if I'm clicking the element I want to inspect, I'm going to compute it. You see it tells me that the width is 70 pixels, the height is 100 pixels, and the margin right is 20 pixels. You can see it here. Of course, just like margin right, I can have margin left, or I can even have margin top and margin bottom. But for now, I'm just going to use margin right. Of course, another way of specifying the pixels, I can use rems. So if I'm using run rem, is 1 unit of the font size of the root element. And the default font size of the root element, which is this HTML element, is 16 pixels. So just like specifying here 16 pixels. And as you can see, again, I'm going over this element here, I have 16 pixels to the right. Now this is margin, and what you can see margin does, it adds space to the outside of the element. It doesn't matter if I will add margin, let's do margin bottom. We'll add some space into the bottom of the element, but there is nothing under it, so we don't really see how it affects our page. We can do also margin left, and it adds some space to the left side, and it kind of pushes everything to the right. And of course, we can do margin top, which adds spacing to the top of the element. So it pushes this element to the bottom. So we can specify a lot of types of margin. a shortcut for it, if I want all of the sizes to be the same, I can use just margin without any size, and it will apply the value to all of the sides. Let me show you how it looks like. Okay, so it applies 16 pixels to all of the sides of the margin, okay, to all top, left, right, and bottom. And I can also specify it by values. I can specify 4 values when I'm using margin without a specific position. I can do 1 rem, maybe half rem, 1.25 rem, and 0.25 rem. And what I'm saying here, this is top, right, bottom, and left. And this pattern kind of continues in CSS. We'll see it also in padding. I'm telling the browser, I want just to specify all of the sides of the margin in one line. So I'm just using margin without any sides. Provide 4 values. The first one is top, the second one is right, the third one is bottom, and the fourth one is left. And you can see it here, the sizes applies to everything. The second part is, instead of applying spacing to the outside of the element, I want to apply spacing to the inside of the element. Why do I want to do that? Let me show you an example. Let's use padding, or let's use padding top in this case. And I want to apply some spacing to the inside of the element, and you will see what is the difference between inside and outside. Let's say 8 pixels. Now what you can see that by applying some padding or padding top and some spacing to the inside of the element, it has the space as part of the content, as part of the element itself. Why is it useful? Because we can see here that the padding allows us to continue the background. The background is applied to the inner element, to the inside of the element. The background is not applied for the margin parts, for example. We have this pink background and we have some margin values, and the background is not applied to the margin spacing outside of the element. And when we use padding, the background is applied to the inside of the element. So it's kind of just like it says, padding the element with some, you can think of it like some cushion or something. And padding follows the same pattern as margin. We have padding top, we have padding bottom. Now it applies some cushion to the bottom of it, but again, don't see it because there is not enough content to push everything to the end. We can put some padding left. It has some padding to the left of it. And we can also use just padding. And I will use now 1 rem. So it applies padding to all of the sides, top, bottom, left, and right, with the value of 1 rem, which is 16 pixels. And if I go to compute it, you can see it here. I have margin and I also have padding, 16 pixels to each side. And it's very useful, this screen here, the computed part, because if I have a lot of values and those values are rems and I can't really understand why the things doesn't work the way I want, I can go to compute it and see what are the actual sizes and properties that are calculated. Another important part to understand here, that the total size of this element is, let's talk about the width in this case. It's 70 pixels plus 16 to the left plus 16 to the right. So eventually the size is much larger than 70 pixels. Okay, I'm taking 70 pixels and the padding is added to the initial width. And usually it's kind of counterintuitive, because when we look at designs or where we think about our elements, we think about them as a fixed size or fixed width or height, and the padding is added to the inside. It's not adding some extra pixels to this element. One thing we can do is do box sizing and use border box. And this is telling the browser, you know what, let me copy it here. Sorry, copy it here. Let me delete this one. I want it to be applied to the CSS class in this case again. And what it's telling to the browser, do not add the padding to the width. So take the width and add extra pixels with the padding, but calculate the padding with the width. So even if I have padding, the total width of the element is 70 pixels. And it's much more counterintuitive. I think that almost everyone in modern websites are using this value. And I will go here And what you can see that even though I have 70 pixels width, it says that I have 38 pixels width. Why is that? It takes 70 pixels and subtracts 16 from the left and 16 from the right. It doesn't apply to the margin. Okay, the margin stays outside no matter what is the width inside. But the padding is calculated together with the width, and the total width is calculated together with the padding. So I'm getting a total of 70 pixels even though I have padding. And if I remove the padding, the width stays the same, because this is the idea of border box, to keep the width the same whether it has padding or not. So padding is not adding extra pixels, just calculated with the width that is specified. And one thing that you will see a lot in browsers, let me copy those values because I don't have them here. So because we want to have this trick that I showed you to calculate the width and the padding together instead of adding extra pixels, usually what we do is using these asterisks, okay? And I'm going to say box sizing, content box, or sorry, border box, refresh the page, and it applies to everything. What is this asterisk? This is kind of a wildcard. It tells the browser, apply this CSS to all of the elements of the page. Doesn't matter if they have classes, doesn't have classes. This is something you want to apply to everything. And it's something that we're going to use a lot. And I use it in all of my websites. I just add these CSS properties to the top. And it tells the browser that if I have padding and even border, it also applies to adding borders to the sides of the element, do not add them to the width, but calculate them together with the width. So the width, the final width of the element doesn't change.